Please welcome to the stage Anu Madgavkar of the McKinsey Global Institute.
Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be back at Concordia to share highlights of our new research from the McKinsey Global Institute. We launched it just this morning, and it's available for the world. But it's particularly relevant for this group and this audience, because in this research, we shed light on not one, but two pressing generational challenges that the world is grappling with at this time. On the one hand, it's about raising living standards and meeting the aspirations of billions of people around the world who aren't there yet. And on the other hand, equally important, it's protecting the planet from the worst consequences of climate change. And the extent to which we make concerted progress on both these fronts, not just one front, in this decisive decade, will shape the course of the world for generations to come. So let's consider the first goal I talked about, raising the bar. Now, when we think about eliminating poverty over the last 3 decades, some 1.3 billion people around the world have exited extreme poverty. And this is commendable progress by any standards. But development experts argue that it's time to raise the bar. The extreme poverty line, the international poverty line, can get people to a level of bare subsistence. But raising the bar, we argue, could deliver true economic empowerment. Now, we draw on the work of leading academics to frame this idea of an empowerment line. The empowerment line is a threshold of spending. $12 per capita per day in PPP terms is a sort of global floor. And that level changes by country as costs of living change and societal norms change. But $12 PPP is the floor. And this is the floor that actually gets a person to a level of sufficiency on a holistic set of human needs beyond basic subsistence. So that would include good nutrition, decent housing, adequate healthcare, education, energy, transportation, and the like. This is also the level, crucially, that gives a person a certain modest sense of security that minimizes the risks of slipping back into poverty. Now, the closer people get to this empowerment threshold, the more they're able to exercise choice about how they live, how they work, how they consume. They're able to move more easily in search of better work, for example. They're also able to just exercise more choice in the way they save or invest in their own business or in equipping themselves with skills. People who live below this threshold of spending typically face daily struggles in making their ends meet. And there's a lot of vulnerability and stress in that kind of existence. But today, 61% of the world lives below the empowerment line. That's 4.7 billion people worldwide who face a daily struggle. And they're distributed all over the world, 2.5 billion or so in emerging and developing Asia, 1 billion or so in Africa. But even in the advanced economies, we find that 15 to 20% of people, about 300 million people in all, are still below the relevant threshold of empowerment within these societies. So if we make decisive progress in meeting their needs, by 2050, a whole generation could be raised economically empowered, more productive, and more able to realize their potential. So that's really the first big existential challenge for the world that we can't afford to ignore. But this comes at the same time as the second generational challenge, one we're all very familiar with. Here we say that we know that the clock is ticking. We need to get on track for net zero by 2050. But this involves massive shifts in our energy systems, our industrial infrastructure, in our land use systems. Big shifts will be needed across sectors like power, mobility, buildings, industry, agriculture, forestry. And this will involve more expenditure. It will involve shifting our pattern of spending towards low emissions alternatives. We think that the step up in such spending will be to the tune of $41 trillion over a 10-year period. So that's a large shift the world must achieve if we are to make progress on the climate front, and it's the second generational challenge that we shed light on. What happens when we bring these two gaps together and consider them on a coordinated basis? We find that on a combined basis, the gaps are quite immense. 8% of global GDP each year would need to shift towards meeting both these needs. How do we get to 8%? On the net zero side, I talked about the $41 trillion of spending on low emissions. That's roughly 4% of global GDP each year. And on the empowerment side, if you look at what it would cost in terms of spending to meet essential needs for the 4.7 billion people who don't yet have them, that would be $37 trillion over a decade, or another 4% of GDP. This is a global picture, but the picture varies region by region and country by country. For developing and emerging countries in the global south, their share of the empowerment gap is 80%, and most of the stress and pressure is actually on that account. For advanced economies, they have to shoulder about 20% on the empowerment side, but a larger gap on the net zero side in line with their emissions. There are many large middle-income countries that are in the crosshairs, facing large gaps on both fronts. All of this seems overwhelming, but there is room to cheer. And we find considerable optimism in the idea that market-led opportunities, growth, and business-led innovation can help us make tremendous progress on both fronts. Now, when we think about economic inclusion or empowerment, what growth does is unlock productivity in farm sectors, in non-farm sectors, creating whole new industries, new business models, and billions of better-paying jobs. And if businesses and employers can skill and equip workers to take on those jobs, some 2/3 of this big empowerment gap could actually be bridged within the time span of a decade. On the net zero side, what does growth and innovation do? Here we find some interesting effects. Growth generates financial resources. We've been hearing through the day that climate finance and the need to invest and spend is a huge bottleneck and challenge. Growth actually helps you do that. Of course, growth raises emissions too. And so we need to work even harder on the low emissions alternatives to make up for that. But innovation reduces the costs of these technologies, and that's a critical part of solving the puzzle. When we look at this granularly, sector by sector, technology by technology, region by region, we find some $10 trillion of investable opportunities could come on stream in the next 10 years based on opportunities that are in the money, that are cost competitive relative to fossil fuel alternatives. And this comes about through R&D, through innovation, through scaling, through learning by doing, and that's a critical part of solving the net zero puzzle. Put together, growth and innovation can address something like half of the combined gaps. So everyone's wondering, what about the other half? There is a pathway to solve that too, but that's the pathway that requires stepped up societal commitments. We as societies can choose to deploy public resources. Governments can do this, multilaterals can do this, philanthropic entities can do this. On the empowerment side, public commitments could help build affordable housing and healthcare and raise social transfers. On the net zero side, public capital can play a crucial role. What it does here is step in and occupy the spaces that private capital won't go into because risk-return equations don't really work. This can also crowd in more private capital. So the solutions exist as a combination of private market frameworks, but also stepped up public capital. This comes with its own implications. It would require massive cross-border transfers. We noted earlier the imbalances around the world. It would require new mechanisms of public finance, and it might have effects on the baseline economy and on growth itself. But the solutions and the tools are there. And as we confront both these challenges, what's really important is to think about the whole puzzle and not just bits and pieces of it. Very often we think in silos, but what we need to do is acknowledge that economic empowerment, sustainability, and growth and innovation are three critical and essential parts of the same connected system. We can't push hard on anyone, without considering the implications of the others. We need all three to pull along as three engines moving in a consistent and coherent direction. It's also clear that we can't let half the world stay poor. And what's the idea of poverty, the idea of sufficiency is evolving as people's expectations change. We must acknowledge that. That means the climate transition must become more affordable. Growth and innovation actually give us the tools, they give us the resources that we can exploit. They're not the whole answer, but they are an important part of the first wave of prioritized actions that are actually win-wins for everyone. They can advance both prosperity and the planet. We need to grasp these opportunities with a sense of clear-eyed optimism about them. Thank you.